Several years ago, I launched a nonprofit that I described at the time as an ecosystem coordinator. We were working in education in the United States, a complex sector with lots of different organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, and a variety of clients. And I remember at the time talking with some other professional services firms, and they didn't know about any examples of other ecosystem coordinators and weren't really sure what it meant. And it's been interesting to me because over the last several years, I've encountered many situations where individuals and leaders are trying to coordinate complex either movements or sectors. And this frame of ecosystem coordinator has been really valuable. And so I started documenting what ecosystem coordination meant for me and thought it would be helpful to share a framework as well as a brief example of what ecosystem coordination actually looks like. And it was useful for me just to identify several steps that really do constitute a process that a leader can go through to try and help make this happen. So the starting point in this work is to define the goal. What is it we're trying to achieve? What is it that we want to have happen in the ecosystem? And so really clarifying the purpose of the work and then continuing to clarify it and refine it over time. Because one of the things I found in this work is the goal changes as we move from launching something new or beginning some initial work in an ecosystem versus making ongoing progress. Once the goal is clear, the next step is to map the ecosystem. So what are the types of actors and organizations that are in the ecosystem? Who's out there? Making initial connections with these people, and then also gathering other relevant background data about the problem we're trying to solve, the nature of the ecosystem, the types of players, and so forth. And then starting to really brainstorm, what are the types of solutions we might think about? And then what are the elements or the segments of the ecosystem? And the deliverable at the end of this stage is basically a map that describes what is the ecosystem, what is the nature of how value is created, how the pieces fit together, what important data is there, and so forth. From there, we then explore the different parts of this ecosystem. So once we've identified the segments in the ecosystem, what do they each do? And continuing to build relationships with key contacts, refining the definitions of the segments, and then really starting to frame the problem more clearly. What is it we're trying to do? Looking for gaps, looking for leverage points, and then again, this continuous iterative process. So as we learn more, let's update the ecosystem map. Maybe we're even starting to update the goal and get it more clear. But at the end of this stage, we really have an assessment of each of the segments. So what are they? How do they work? And what might some initial strategies might be? Then the next step is to define specific strategies for each of these segments. What is it we're going to do to make progress? And so it really depends on us understanding what each of the segments are, their key characteristics, figure out what the leverage points are. So how can we make a big impact in this segment? What's needed? And part of this is really seeing which segments have active players and what do those folks do? And then synthesizing it all into a coherent strategy. And so ultimately the deliverable here is a strategy for each of the segments. So we know what is it we're trying to achieve in each of the parts of the ecosystem. And then we execute. So we've got these strategies, we've identified them, we start executing, continuing to network, continuing to build relationships, but then take specific action in each segment that helps make progress. And what I found is we may not be taking action in every segment at the same time. We may start in a few, take actions in the first ones. As we make progress, then we mobilize action in other places. And the actions can be different. So some segments we may need to fund existing organizations. Sometimes we want to launch a new organization. In some cases, we may just be creating materials, but having a clear strategy for each of the segments of the ecosystem. And then we see how it's going, right? We assess the impact of these actions, and then we iterate and the cycle starts again. And so it really is not a one-step process. It's an ongoing iterative loop of defining and updating the goal, mapping the ecosystem, exploring the segments of the ecosystem, developing strategies, executing them, and then iterating. And so, for example, in my education work, my goal was to help accelerate the implementation of high-quality blended learning or personalized learning in schools across the country. And so in that case, what we did was define the goal. I actually chose at the beginning not to be very specific about what exactly we meant about blended learning. When we said we wanted every school district to implement blended learning effectively, we chose not to be overly specific because at the time there were organizations that were resisting the use of technology at all, let alone blended learning. So at the beginning, I did not have a clear goal. However, about 12 or 18 months later, things had changed and I refined the goal to be very specific. And so I defined the goal of the work and evolved the definition over time as we made progress. Then mapping the ecosystem. So at the beginning, it was a lot of networking. What are the different organizations that are out there? What are they trying to do? What organizations seem like they're promising? What are the sources of resistance for the changes that we're talking about? And so really doing a lot of networking and then gathering data about the different areas. So for example, one of the things we talked about was internet connectivity for schools or students having enough devices. We needed to gather data to see how much of that existed in the current state so we could figure out where the gaps were and what work was needed. Then we dove deeper into these different segments. So we ended up defining what I called a value chain, which meant if we want every school in the country to implement blended learning, they all need to do the same things. They need to have enough internet connectivity, enough devices for students, software systems, support for teachers and training, communications materials, financial plans. And so district after district and school after school needed to do these things. We needed to be sure they had the ability to do that. And so we were looking for organizations or solutions in each of these segments: internet connectivity, devices, teacher training, and so forth. And then ultimately I ended up having a member of my team who was responsible for each of these segments. And so these individuals were responsible for exploring each segment, understanding the key issues, identifying the leverage points, and then ultimately developing a strategy for each of these segments so we could look across the whole ecosystem, see all of what the options were, decide what to do at a point in time, and then iterate. And so in my case, we started out working on 3 of the segments. And then as we made progress and added more people, we expanded our work. And so eventually we were working not just on internet connectivity and devices and training for teachers, but we started working on finance plans and communications plans and other segments, which did not all start at the beginning, but we did add them over time. And then finally, it was a matter of executing. And so once we had the strategies, we looked at what resources we had, both people and dollars. We prioritized and took action, and then we moved forward. So continuing to iterate as we built out our networks, and then again, took the different types of actions. In some cases, we funded an existing organization to help accelerate internet connectivity work. We launched a new organization in the software space. In the communication space, we didn't do anything that major. We actually hired a consultant to create a toolkit. And so we didn't need to create a new organization or provide significant funding for an existing one, but we did pay for some materials to be created. And sometimes that's all it takes. And so it's important to recognize the different segments, develop a strategy and implement it. And then finally, continuing to assess and iterate. And so as we made progress, we looked and saw how it worked. We saw how our status in the ecosystem changed, and then we adapted our strategy accordingly. And so these are the kind of steps that I would recommend that you could take in your organizations as you think about identifying an ecosystem, mapping that ecosystem, developing a strategy, implementing, and then iterating over time.